Hello and welcome. My name is Scott Cross with the Institute for Faith and Freedom, and we thank you for joining us for the American Founding with Dr. Jay Cost. In the second lecture today, Dr. Cost will be speaking on why America. After the lecture, there will be a brief Q&A session, so if you have any questions about tonight's material, you can direct them at Dr. Cost after the lecture. And without further ado, Dr. Cost.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. Let's see here. We're just going to wait 1 second, everybody, because I don't know if you know this, but one of the things that we're doing here is we're also streaming this live on X, which we think is a great way to sort of spread the message about Grove City in the Institute for Faith and Freedom. It's a way to sort of get other people who otherwise wouldn't be familiar with the Institute to be aware of what it does, and also just the important aspects of Grove City College. So when the X broadcast starts here in a second, you're going to hear me give a plug for Grove City College, which I'm gonna be doing every week. It's gonna be something you guys as Grovers are familiar with, but people out there maybe not as familiar. And let's see here. Okay, we are live on X as well as with Grove City College. So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the second episode of The American Founding with me. I'm Jay Cost. And those of you who are watching on X probably are not aware of this, well, you wouldn't be, but I have a fantastic producer here from Grove City College. His name is Scott. Thank you, Scott, for helping and participating. What I would like to do before we begin is just remind everybody that it is Grove City College and the Institute for Faith and Freedom that is bringing this broadcast to you tonight on X. And I just want to let people know that Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania ranks among the best colleges and universities, not only in my fine Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but the United States. The emphasis here is on intellectual, moral, spiritual, social development consistent with Christian principles. And one of the really cool things about Grove City College is it is truly independent of the federal government. It accepts no federal funding, including federal student aid, which enables the college to operate free of governmental interference or political influence. It's a great aspect of this school. I think it's one of the things that makes it so unique. You can find out more at faithandfreedom.com. Okay, so with that having been said, so those of you who are watching on X, I believe I've enabled chat this week. So we'll see. It's I'm not exactly sure, but I'm pretty sure chat will be enabled here. So you'll be able to sort of follow along. And if you have questions at the end of the episode, you can just chat in the X bar there. And those of you who are watching with us on Zoom, the Zoom chat is open as well. So this second lecture or second episode, I guess, is that the title of it is Why America? And when I was thinking about this, I was sort of inspired by Alexis de Tocqueville, a very easy person to be inspired by. And my goal here is not to recapitulate Tocqueville's argument, but I find Tocqueville as a character really interesting in his sort of analytical puzzle, because Tocqueville comes to the United States in the 1820s, and he's originally coming to study prisons, which he does too. But the title of his two books is Democracy in America, and it's really not hard to see Tocqueville as a Frenchman being puzzled by this because, of course, the French by this point have round tripped, right? They went from the Bourbon monarchy to the French Republic to Napoleon and all the way back to the reign of the Bourbons. So democracy seemed to have not really worked in France. So why does democracy work in the United States? Or maybe what we would probably call republicanism is probably what Tocqueville is thinking about here, right? Why does democracy work in the United States? And as I was putting this podcast together, I was thinking back to 2004, 20 years ago, 2005, with George W. Bush's second inaugural address. And back then, I think a lot of us, myself included, because I was in my mid-20s at the time, and it really kind of felt like democracy was on the march. You had seen the events of the fall of Eastern Europe. It seemed, most of Eastern Europe had established itself as democracies, and today they still are. There was still reason to think that Russia was going to be reasonably democratic, and that Afghanistan was, and that Iraq was as well. And President Bush is surveying this and sort of gives a message of this idea of America being this great democratizing force. And this is what he says, among other things. He says, "We go forward with complete confidence in the eventual triumph of freedom. Not because history runs on the wheels of inevitability, it is human choices that move events. Not because we consider ourselves a chosen nation, God moves and chooses as he wills. We have confidence because freedom is the permanent hope of mankind, the hunger in dark places, the longing of the soul." I mean, maybe, but and it's hard to sort of look at that 20 years on and think that that's as as Bush had said, maybe in the moment it made sense. But I think it's probably clear by now, and maybe should have been clear there, that this longing of the soul is contingent upon a lot of factors, economic, cultural, social forces. I think that was one of Tocqueville's points, right? That democracy came to America for unique reasons that were particular to the United States. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. And I'm going to talk about this next week too, because I think it's a really important phenomenon that is worth bearing in mind. Why the United States? And to break this down into sort of two separate chunks, what I want to do is think about the two meanings of the word freedom. The first meaning of the word freedom is the one commonly we think about today, which is the idea that government authority is limited, that there is some kind of sphere of personal autonomy, which we might call the liberal version of freedom. Not liberal as in 21st century progressivism, but liberal in the more classical sense, maybe the sense that somebody like a Milton Friedman would think about it. That's going to be the subject next week. The context in which the Americans expected and understood that a government appropriately was limited and that they were due a sphere of personal autonomy, either in their home life as well as in their economic life. But there's another meaning of the word freedom, and it's something that traces back to antiquity, classical republicanism. And this is the freedom that stems from citizen participation in the government. If we think about the law as a restraining force in our lives, we are, you could say, enslaved to the law because the law rules us. But in a republic, you are enslaved, or you better put, you are bound by laws that you participate in creating. Right. So you are free because you are a slave to nobody but yourself, because you participate in the lawmaking process. You are both ruler and ruled. That's what I want to talk about this week. And the idea of this coming to the United States or to America, not just in a limited sense, but in a very, very broad sense, in a bracingly for the age democratic sense. And to this, Gordon Wood has written about this, the radicalism of the American Revolution. His argument is that the revolution sort of unleashed this radical democratizing force. And this is not to dispute this, but to sort of suggest that the one of the reasons that the revolution could unleash this force in such a productive, constructive way was because the social, economic, political conditions were already there. So what do I mean by that? So let's dig in. The first thing we have to consider is what is in America the establishment of a democratic republic among the people of Western civilization. What is a democratic republic such as ours replacing? Well, it was ultimately replacing the medieval system that had developed over the course of a millennium in Europe. And it is a hierarchy that still, as of 1776, characterized much of the European world. And the medieval era, you can date the end of medievalism at different points. You could maybe Luther's Reformation, you could date it to the Italian Renaissance, you could date it to the French Revolution. There's all sorts of ways to think about this. But the reason there's so many different ways to think about this is because medievalism was almost a kind of all-encompassing force in society. So it doesn't get destroyed in Europe overnight, right? But medievalism is ultimately, as a social construct, is a hierarchy. It is not an equality, it's a hierarchy that characterized much of the European world. And it was based upon three essential forces in society. There are those who fight, right? That would be by, the towards the end of the medieval era, that's going to be the landed aristocracy, but they had become the landed aristocracy because their ancestors were the warrior class, and their capacity to monopolize violence enabled them to carve out economic and political privileges for themselves. They leveraged that into the ability to rule, right? So the aristocrats are going to be the ancestors, the descendants of the warrior class. So that's the first group. There are those who pray. That's going to be the Catholic Church, and it's important to appreciate, especially for people who are, modern and Protestant in their background, that when we think of the church, we're not simply thinking about the parish church, for the village or whatever, that there's also the monastic system, which had evolved over the course of the Middle Ages and had facilitated the massive accumulation of wealth for the church. The church is the single largest landowner in Europe, and they control things through monasteries. And monasteries control huge swaths of land. They're ultimately responsible to the Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy, which is responsive to Rome. And so you see then, therefore, high church officials. And then finally, there are those who work. That's everybody else. And if you've ever watched a medieval movie or read a medieval story and thought about how much fun it would be to be a knight or something in the Middle Ages, if you were to sort of by chance find yourself living in the Middle Ages, there's about a 95% chance that you would be among those who work. In other words, the peasants. That's pretty much everybody. And this hierarchy is sanctioned by divine ordination in the medieval mindset. Historians have since labeled it as the great chain of being. It's this idea that God, in his divine wisdom, his inscrutable wisdom, has organized not just human society, but all of creation into this particular hierarchy. And you have a place in this hierarchy, and that's where you belong. So if you are a peasant, you come from peasants, your children will be peasants. If you are, maybe a shoemaker or a shoe cobbler, again, you come from shoe cobblers, you will leave behind shoe cobblers. That's how it works, right? And for about 250 years prior to the revolution, maybe more like 300 years, but thereabouts, this had been challenged at various points. The Renaissance is certainly a challenge. The Renaissance is a challenge because the Renaissance is going back to the ancient world to look at ancient ways of being and modernizing those ancient ways of being for practical experience today. And the Renaissance, probably a good example of that would be the revival of Cicero. Cicero was read during the Middle Ages, but he was only read for the Latin. You weren't supposed to read Cicero for his ethical theories or his political theories because he was a pagan. But it's in the Renaissance, scholars and thinkers and educators are looking at Cicero as a model of how to live a good life and how to live a life of virtue. The Reformation is probably the single greatest challenge to the hierarchy of the medievalism, because what Luther effectively does is if you think about the medieval church as a hierarchy, Luther topples it with his what he calls the priesthood of all believers, or what gets called that, right? Which is also facilitated by the printing press, the proliferation of the written word, and also the trade revolution, too. If you think about merchants, there had always been merchants in the medieval era, but merchants don't exactly fit into this hierarchy in a clean way. And in fact, the more merchants you have in a given place, the less likely you are to have medieval rules of governance. Like, for instance, if you look at Florence or you look at Venice, those would be places that don't reflect this medieval hierarchy. You could even look more later at the English Civil Wars. It was not coincidental that it was the merchant class of London that was most likely to be Puritan in the conflict with the king and also least sympathetic to the king. So what happens as the medieval social order is being challenged, what you get is frequent conflict, right? You can't tear down a social system without expecting conflict over what replaces it. You see particularly civil wars over religion, the English civil wars of the 1600s. You also get the wars or the bloodshed of the Protestant Reformation, Queen Mary's Counter Reformation. You get the French Civil Wars between Henry of Navarre and the last members of the Valois dynasty. You get easily the most bloody is the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 1600s, and you get also the Glorious Revolution in England in 1689. So this had been challenged, but it was still extant in Europe. Medievalism doesn't fall apart overnight. It simply could not, right? But what I want to get at here, though, is how this system does not have a lot of relevance in America. Okay. It does not have a lot of relevance in America. A good way to think about this maybe is if you are familiar with Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Jefferson draws a lot of his ideas about the divine nature of not divine, but this ideas of natural rights and natural liberty from a political theorist by the name of John Locke. And Locke had made an argument in the 1670s and 80s, imagining a hypothetical state called the state of nature where there was no government. And everybody was naturally free and everybody was naturally equal. Now, if you're an Englishman reading this in the 1680s, this is really just a theoretical construct. It is a thought experiment. But if you are a colonist in Philadelphia in, say, 1687, and you're looking around, Locke's description of a society that doesn't, that is free and equal is actually kind of close to just a simple description of reality. All right. And I want to sort of break this down by what I mean here and take it sort of piece by piece here. Let's think about these three hierarchical orders within Europe, those who fight. Okay. Now think about those who fight. That's the aristocracy. Now, the British Crown in America does grant titles of nobility, excuse me, does grant land to British noblemen, but it never creates American titles of nobility, right? So there is no, at the time of the Revolution, there is no aristocratic class in the United States of America. In other words, there are people who own a lot of land. And in the South, you have an aristocratic social hierarchy, particularly in Virginia and particularly in South Carolina, but it is not reinforced by formal titles of nobility. And the advantage of a title of nobility in Europe was really claim to land ownership. Land was the primary source of wealth until the Industrial Revolution, or at least certainly until the Commercial Revolution, the Trade Revolution. In the Middle Ages, land is the primary source of wealth, and land in Europe is scarce, especially good land. Arable land is scarce, but land is cheap in America. Land is also plentiful. Land is so plentiful that people can, sort of have a kind of upward mobility. Good examples of that include James Madison's grandfather, Ambrose, who moves out to the Virginia Piedmont. The Madisons had been a middling landowner class in the Tidewater. It wasn't perfectly, anybody could do anything. You had to know people. Ambrose Madison knew people, and he was able to lay claim to land in the Virginia Piedmont. Peter Jefferson was the same way. This idea that, the Jeffersons had been a middling landowner class in the Tidewater area, but they could move out to the Piedmont and get more land. right? So land is relatively cheap. And that's the important thing I want to emphasize here too. This is all relative. America relative to Europe. Land is relatively cheap and it's plentiful. And also there was a percolating kind of status anxiety in among the American landed class, particularly in the South, who wanted to model themselves on European aristocracy, but did not have those titles. And they also did not have the wealth, by the way. Another thing that really undermines this idea of those who work or a peasant class is the mercantile system, which is ironic because the mercantile system had been a source of, the colonists certainly saw it as a source of economic oppression, right? But the mercantile system was built on this ideology that colonies existed, the English colonies, the French colonies, the Dutch colonies existed to enrich the mother country, especially in the mother country's domestic supply of precious metals, particularly gold. So that meant that the colonies had certain functions. They were supposed to sell natural resources to the mother country that they would then be refined. So, like for instance, in North Carolina, if you're in the timber business, you're not in the furniture business. You're selling your timber back to England for them to manufacture it into furniture. That's the sort of idea, right? Um, and the other function that the colonies were supposed to do is to buy the manufactured goods back. Okay. And this is for the colonists a very unstable system because the colonists are continually buying more than they're selling. So they're going into debt. There's a whole underlying tension within mercantilism. But one of the challenges that mercantilism creates is that to do mercantilism, you need a very large colonial merchant class. Right? You have to have people in the colonies selling stuff back to merchants in the mother country. And so, sure enough, you have these cities pop up. You have Philadelphia, you have New York, you have Boston, but also smaller places like Richmond and Charleston. You have a merchant class. And again, merchants don't really fit into this medieval ideology. Right. Like I said, it's not to say that there hadn't been a merchant class in medieval Europe, but it is to say that the more the merchants are, the more of a threat there is to the existing ideological order. Right. So you get this, and it's interesting. Sort of a way to think about this is when you think about the sort of two places where the revolution really takes root first and most intensely. You think about somebody like Richard Henry Lee in Virginia. He's part of the landowning class down there, and also the Adamses in Boston. So who is that? It's an alliance between these up and coming Virginia landowners and Boston merchants, right? Neither of whom really fit into this traditional aristocratic class. So that's one problem that the medieval system has in America. So let's think about those who pray, the religious order. Religion is a factor in American uniqueness. Maybe at some point we'll talk about the Great Awakening, which happens in America in the 1730s and 1740s. And so religion plays a direct role, I think, or at least a more direct role in the American Revolution. But the uniqueness of religion in America creates a sort of a kind of social condition that can facilitate revolution, right? In all of Europe, church and state were integrated. And they're in certainly in the Middle Ages, but even as we get into the modern era, right, church and state are integrated. I'm pretty sure everywhere. Maybe there's a couple pockets left by the 1700s. I don't think so. And during the medieval era, they were in a symbiotic relationship before the emergence of Protestantism. Okay. So the church would get military protection from the state. The church also avoided having to pay taxes on its landholding. And the church also sacralized the political order. So you can think of this, the phrase, by the grace of God, King Louis XIV or whatever, like this idea that the king is God's anointed. And how do we know this? Because the church has anointed him on behalf of God, right? So there's sort of how this is managed. And before the printing press, it was relatively easy for the Catholic Church to tamp down on what it considered heresy, right? So, for instance, you have the Lollard Rebellion of the 14th century in England that is sort of like stomped out pretty easily because, frankly, it was really hard to spread ideas before the invention of the printing press. But after the printing press, you get the technological precondition for Reformation, And the challenge for the church is now that there's an alternative there's an alternative power center. In other words, maybe if I ever put the authority of the church is challenged, right? First by Luther in Germany, and then by Zwingli and Calvin in Switzerland, and then you sort of see it spread from there into the Netherlands, into Scandinavia, into Scotland, and ultimately into England. And the question is, this is a major question for European society to deal with, and that is, what do you do with those who dissent? What do you do with people who have different viewpoints of religion with you? Today, the answer is very simple. In the United States of America, we tolerate each other. You can be Catholic, I can be Protestant. You can be an atheist, I can be Protestant. You can be Muslim, I can be Buddhist, whatever. We sort of resolve that decisions like that are matters of personal conscience. But that was not really the original decision, right? And instead, what we see as the Protestant Revolution is sprouting up in the 1500s and into the 1600s, you get all sorts of varieties of civil war. The immediate reaction of pretty much all of European society is to sort of tamp down on religious dissent. Germany gets it worse with the 30 Years' War, and you sort of can see the evolution of various political solutions. Ultimately, the Holy Roman Empire adopts cuius regio eius religio, which basically means that if you think about the Germany as being, hundreds of tiny little principalities, whatever your local prince was, that's what you had to be. So if you have a Catholic prince, you have to be Catholic, but you were allowed to move within the empire, right? That's what you get after the Peace of Westphalia that ends the 30 Years' War. France, you get the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which gives limited toleration, but when Louis XIV consolidates power, it's repealed, and so France by this point is just Catholic. Great Britain, Henry VIII destroys the monasteries and basically destroys the church structure. His daughter Mary tries to rebuild. Elizabeth builds out the Via Media that becomes the basis for the Church of England, and you have the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution over this time. So England evolves into toleration for Protestants, and by the 1800s, toleration will extend to Catholics. Okay. Now, but this is where we get into what is something that's really interesting. I think one of the most fascinating things about the American colonies, right, is because the British are using the colonies to get rich, but the British are also using the colonies to invite their dissidents to leave, right? Why don't you go off to the colonies? And the way to think about the colonies in a lot of respects is the colonies are this kind of release valve for people who can't get along with the English religious settlement, particularly people who cannot get along with the Elizabethan settlement of the Church of England. The first to go, obviously, are the Pilgrims, and then later on you get the Puritans, these people who want sort of radical reforms to the Church of England. That leads to the Massachusetts colony, it leads to the Connecticut colony, it leads to the New Hampshire colony. You also get the Catholics are go to Maryland. Lord Baltimore basically gets the right to build the Maryland colony. Maryland is also the first place where you get genuine religious toleration, although it doesn't last. Rhode Island becomes a place for people who are dissidents from Puritan-controlled Massachusetts. And then Pennsylvania and Delaware are a haven for the Quakers, who also, like the Puritans, like the Catholics at this point, cannot get along, cannot prosper under the Elizabethan religious settlement, or at least as it's becoming the Carolingian settlement after the end of the English Civil War. And then you also get, with the defeat of the Dutch, New York and New Jersey, which are brought in after having been Dutch colonies, and the Dutch had already been tolerant. So if you're keeping count, that's 9 colonies, right? 9 colonies that are at least in part downstream of the need to get rid of people who can't get along with the mainstream religious viewpoints in England, or at least in Europe. And this ends up getting reinforced in a lot of these colonies because, particularly Pennsylvania, to a lesser extent, New Jersey and Delaware, they have religious toleration. So when Germans are fleeing, like German Baptists are fleeing because they don't really fit in the Holy Roman Empire, where do they come? What's the one place in the world that they can go to? They can go to Pennsylvania, which is, by the way, a big reason why Pennsylvania today, of I think all 50 states still has the most German American population, right? Now, this is not to say that religious liberty was a colonial-wide phenomenon. It certainly was not. But with so many refugees from Orthodoxy, it means the church is not going to and cannot play a homogenizing role. And really, there's only a handful of colonies where there's an established church that has a lot of sway. I probably would say Virginia, uh, but it's sort of staggering a little bit by the time of the Revolution. South Carolina, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. All right. What this means then, if we return to this sort of medieval model, right, we don't have those who fight being a social category that is given kind of political power. And then we also don't have those who pray. Right? We don't have those people either. They're not part of the hierarchy either. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't religious people. It's just to say that the church as an established institution doesn't have the kind of political, cultural, social authority that it possesses in Europe. It certainly has a moral authority, but that's very different. Right? So those who fight, those who pray, that only leaves one group, those who work, which is pretty much America, right? And over the course of the 1700s, this is a large portion of people who, at least among the white population, they work for themselves. Given the inexpensiveness of land, you could get a kind of rough equality. Um, it's to our sort of way of looking at things today, it looks very hierarchical and very unequal. But when you think of it in the context of what Western civilization looked like up to that point in time, it is really shockingly egalitarian. I'll give you an example. In 1776, after as the colonies are declaring their independence, I mean, really, they're all de facto in rebellion at this point, and they're all going out to write their own constitutions as they're meeting in Philadelphia to formally declare independence. And so one of the things that they do in these places is they call votes. Like you vote for delegates to go to a convention to write a constitution. Virginia has one of these in 1776. Um, James Madison is a delegate at this convention. It's one of the reasons why I know more about this than other things is because I researched Madison. Turnout in that election in 1776 was about 50% of white men, which is extraordinary. Because and it's extraordinary because there were property qualifications. I think you had to have, this is off the top of my head. I think you had to have 50 undeveloped acres of land that you had either owned or had a permanent rent to, or 30 acres of developed land, or you could own a plot of land in a chartered town, right? And so 50% of white men could meet that qualification. And then you look up at New England and you think about the prevalence of direct democracy. And why not? The New Englanders had been by immigration overwhelmingly middle class. They lived together in small, tight-knit communities. They were Puritans and they disdained an ecclesiastical hierarchy. Why shouldn't they work out their problems together? Right? And again, this might seem limited to us today. Well, it's only 50% of white men, which is going to be, like something like 35% of the entire population of Virginia. Yes, but when you think about what's going on in Europe, what's the rate of participation in Europe? In the House of Commons, it's probably like 10% of men, right? In France, it's one guy. It's Louis the 16th, right? And as his great-great-grandfather said, l'état est moi. I am the state, right? Political power is centralized in one person. That's the ancien regime. That's the autocracy. Same thing in Russia. Political power effectively belongs to one guy. So what we have then is what I'm trying to get at here is that on a cultural and social level, no group of people in the West are as primed to govern themselves, right? And they had, I guess my final point of the evening is that they had a lot of practice over the course of the 1700s. If you go back to the 1680s, the Catholic James II had ambitions to reorganize the colonies into what he called the Dominion of New England, that he wanted to sort of have greater direct oversight of the colonies and certainly tamp down on their political control. And the colonists, many of them, particularly in what today is New England, were primed to rebel. But then the Dutch got rid of James II before the New Englanders could, right? James gets overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. William III comes in, and then later on, after the death of Queen Anne, you get George I and George II, these German monarchs. They're not even interested in governing George I and George II. And they're pretty much happy to leave the Americans alone, right? It's known as salutary neglect, is what it gets called in high school textbooks. The crown sends governors over, but otherwise doesn't care. They technically have authority over colonial governments, but they don't really care. They have mercantile laws, but they often go unenforced. And this is another thing too. I think something to bear in mind, which maybe we'll talk about a bit more next week, is that the Americans, colonial Americans, are rampant criminals, just rampant criminals. The amount of bribery of British court officials is truly extraordinary. Right? There's all sorts of, taxes and things that you have to pay, but the Americans just bribe the officials on the dock and they go about their way. The same thing with piracy. The Americans are notoriously good at piracy. So, and this all is going to come back to play later on when the crown begins to assert governing authorities that the crown believes it has, but the Americans are so primed to resist these things that they don't even blink, right? And this period of salutary neglect is basically lasts for a century. I mean, it's like 3 generations long, and you get these places that are effectively governing themselves, and you get this long period of practice in how self-government works. And you get a sense of it's sort of this incubation period of republicanism. And I think a lot of this can be appreciated. Everything that I'm saying, I think, can be appreciated by returning to this example of Alexis de Tocqueville, right? So Tocqueville is saying, why America? And why did democracy work in America? And why did democracy do this epic belly flop in France? Well, let's think about a couple of things about the French Revolution. One of the things that the revolutionaries do early in the revolution is they enact the civil constitution of the clergy, which places the Catholic Church under the control of the French civil authority. Right? Very, very controversial, ends up being really divisive, as like particularly rural Catholics hate this, and it facilitates what becomes counter-revolution, right? The Americans never even had to consider this, right? They never had to consider this because there's no established hierarchical church authority that governs all of America. It just doesn't exist. So the French revolutionaries are trying to uproot the political governing power of the Catholic Church. There's nothing to uproot in America. Another example of this that the French revolutionaries do are the August 4th decrees that officially abolish aristocratic privilege. Again, controversial in France, creates a class, particularly in the aristocratic class, that are counter-revolutionary. And one of the things they do is they run off to the Austrian-controlled Netherlands and begin conspiring an invasion, which is part of what leads to the disaster that becomes the French Revolution. But again, this is something that doesn't happen in America because it doesn't need to. Like, for instance, our Constitution prohibits the state governments from creating titles of nobility. Okay, so which is a good thing. Obviously it's a good thing. But the point is that at no point did the Americans have to abolish existing titles of nobility in the American colonies because they simply didn't exist. And I guess a final point is that one of the differences that I think is sort of overlooked between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is that the French did not have the practice of self-government, right? They didn't have that incubating period where they could learn how to do self-government, right? And the essence of self-government is the ability to resolve disputes without recourse to violence. And that's something that the Americans just had to develop that. I mean, the New Englanders developed this in the course of their town meetings. You just have to. You have to let everybody get their say, and you have to acknowledge people's alternative viewpoints. You have to count for them. And this is something that the French are simply unused to. And maybe it's not a huge surprise, tragic as it is in retrospect, that a couple years within the French Revolution, the revolutionaries themselves returned to violence. So, and what's interesting, and again, this is not to sort of dismiss the point of Gordon Wood, who I think is right that the revolution sort of unlocks this sort of mass kind of radical underpinning democratization movement. But still, in a lot of ways, America as a free republic in the 1780s looks kind of similar to America as the colonies in, say, the 1750s, right? Maybe one way to put this is that sort of related to the fact that there was in America, for instance, a loyalist faction, and it was treated shabbily, right? The loyalists were often abused, and there was disagreement among even families, like Benjamin Franklin's son, who had been the royal governor of New Jersey, I think, had gone off to England, and the loyalists were badly treated, but not nearly as badly treated as they were in France, right? And one of the reasons why is that the Americans didn't have to uproot an existing social order. They didn't have to create entirely new cultural ways of being. These things already existed. And while they were articulated and pushed forward more fully through the process of revolution, the Americans are already have this a lot of the preconditions necessary for self-government. So that was sort of my presentation. I went a little longer than last week, but again, sort of my target for these is kind of, um, uh, about 30 to 40 minutes with maybe 10 or so minutes of questions. Let me just take a look over here. Sorry, I'm looking away. I'm looking at my computer here to see here if get these set up here. So if anybody has any questions, you should feel free. Now would be a great time to ask. And I guess, yeah, so I'll give you a second to sort of think about any questions you might have, and you can feel free to, if you're still watching on X, that's great. If you want to ask a question, the chat is open on X, I believe. I have no idea if it's actually working or not. I think it's working. I don't know. I'll type hello into the chat. Oh, it is working. Okay. So I don't know if anybody's in the chat on X, but we're building this. It's going to take some time to build. So anybody from Grove City in our Zoom conversation have any questions they'd like to ask? It's always awkward to be the first person to ask a question. But it is more awkward to be the lecturer and wait and worry, oh no, nobody has any questions for me. So if you're on the fence about whether or not to ask a question, you'll be doing me a huge favor by actually typing it into the chat because there's nothing worse than than giving a lecture. Well, actually, that's not true because I do teach high school at a small school nearby, and regularly because when you're teaching high school students at the end of a lecture, you say, "Does anybody have any questions?" And I would say 95 times out of 100, nobody has any questions. I'm usually surprised if anybody does have any questions. Um, yeah, let me just say, okay, here we go. In addition to their lack of practice of self-governance, what other factors were in play for the French Revolution to be a failure? That's from Joseph at on our Grove City Zoom chat. That's a great question, Joseph. I think one of the things that is really important uh, in the problem of the French Revolution is that disagreements within the French with among the revolutionaries themselves was made more fraught because of the foreign threat. Okay. Because it wasn't simply that there were opponents of the revolution, it's that Austria and Prussia were opposed to the revolution. You know, and you can imagine Marie Antoinette was, I think by the time the revolution really gets rolling, she's like the cousin of the Austrian emperor. And you can imagine how the Austrians are reacting to the really, really scandalous things they say about Marie Antoinette. And so what this means then is that there's this constant fear among the revolutionaries that people are being traitorous. And that is something that the Americans don't have to worry about because Austria is right across the border in the Netherlands because Austria controlled the Netherlands at that point. Right. So there's really no anxiety about a foreign power manipulating the internal affairs of the revolution. And I think a good example that you can actually see this in American politics, though, if you are familiar with the politics of the 1790s, it is extremely paranoid. There is an extreme amount of paranoia within political culture in the 1790s. And one of the main reasons for that is that the Federalists, the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans already disliked each other. And then the French kill Louis the 16th, England and France go to war, and the Republicans are sympathetic to the French cause. The Federalists are, I don't want to say they're sympathetic to the British cause, they're sympathetic to the economic relationship between the United States and Great Britain. And so you can see as that sort of continues through the 1790s, like Madison, when he's talking about the Federalists and Hamilton, he continuously in his letters he will call them the British Party. In other words, like there's a subtext of, they're treasonous. They're not friends of the revolution. Hamilton at one point says that Madison has a womanly attachment to France. Um, and Adams says, well, Jefferson and Madison, they're in the French party. Hamilton and Pinckney are in the British party. I'm in the American party. And this is even with the war that this conflict all the way across the ocean. Like even with the conflict all the way across the ocean, these guys who had been working together to create this country begin like looking at which one of you is a traitor. Like I know one of you is around here somewhere. And so I think that's probably a factor. Um, let's see. Okay. So this is from somebody. Great talk. However, we here in North Carolina are told that Jefferson stole most of his content. Um, uh, and yes, he kind of did. Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, that great sort of like high flung phraseology of the Declaration of Independence, a lot of it is based upon the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and there were others as well. And I think that Jefferson, I have it on my bookshelf, biography back there, a five-part biography by Alexander Dumas about Jefferson, and I think one of Dumas's I think reflected afterwards that the process of writing um, the biography of Jefferson made him like Jefferson less, which is something that I'm sympathetic to, actually. I should say I'm an alumnus of the University of Virginia, so I actually am indebted to Jefferson and his contributions. But I really like Madison. The more I read about Madison, the more I like him for the most part. I think slavery is probably the exception. The more I learned, the more annoyed and angry I got at him. But Jefferson, every time Jefferson pops up, I feel like you got to keep an eye on Jefferson. There's a couple people back then you really got to keep an eye on, like that'll stab you in the back. Like Jefferson's one of them, Hamilton's one of them for sure. So yeah. This is a question from Paul, or excuse me, from Bill. Why did a religion appear to play a large role in forming the basis for the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution? That's a great question, Bill. We'll probably talk about the role of religion more in the future. I would say that something to bear in mind, there's a kind of a tension within the revolutionary period and the period of framing the government, which is that America at the grassroots level is pretty religious, although religiosity had actually kind of fallen. If you're familiar with the events of the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, that's really meant as a kind of a revivalism. Religiosity had kind of fallen. So it's not as religious usually when we think about America in the early period as being like, um, overflowing with the Holy Spirit. Usually, what our mind is going back to is probably more like either the First Great Awakening in the 1730s or the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s and 30s. But that's just a quibble at the margins. One of the things to bear in mind, though, is interesting about the founding is that the leadership class of the founders the intellectual leaders tend not to be particularly religious, a lot of them, disproportionately. Jefferson, I mean, Jefferson edited the Bible. I mean, well, Madison, his religious sentiments he keeps them very close to the vest, doesn't say a lot about religion in his letters. Monroe, we probably know the least about anybody's religious sentiments is James Monroe. And there was this sort of viewpoint among that was, part of the Enlightenment, this idea of natural religion. And so in a certain sense, there is, when you look at the Declaration and you look at the Constitution, they're not religious in the sense that they're not built upon the idea that the social order is divinely sanctioned, right? They're instead built on this idea that the social order is a human construction and it's meant to protect rights, but those rights are usually referred to as natural, right? And you get this in Jefferson's, like in the Declaration, Jefferson doesn't say endowed by God, endowed by their creator. That's sort of deistic language. But at the same time, and I think this is something that Tocqueville really picks up on, is that there was a broad consensus, even among these guys these leaders who are not themselves religious. There is a broad consensus that religion is a necessary condition for free government, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the thoughts that they have is that a free government, a democratic government, is most likely to be corrupted into a kind of a mob rule, right? Where people who are in charge just rule for themselves, and so you get, the seizure of property and, democratic tyranny. So how does that not happen? Right? How do you prevent a democracy from devolving into tyranny? Well, one of the solutions, obviously, is the Constitution, right? The sort of way to organize the self-interest of individuals within society. You get that. But another way that has to happen, and Madison makes this point at another place, is that you need virtue. Like if you have a citizenry that does not possess virtue, or in other words, the awareness of the need to put the community's good ahead of your own, at least in some ways, and the need to sacrifice your own interests and your own repose to serve the community. I mean, if in sort of military service through the militia or voting or things like that, you have to give of yourself. Where does that impulse come from? Well, the common view was that religion was a source of that kind of civic virtue, right? That it inculcated within people a sense of what I think it's Tocqueville who calls what he calls their self-interest rightly understood. That religion becomes the way in which people are led to understand that there's something bigger than themselves and that they depend upon these other people and that they have obligations to those other people. So yeah. So those were some really great questions. Thank you for those. Let me just conclude by saying if you're interested in some books on this subject, I love book recommendations. I mentioned Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution. You could read Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, although that'll be more the topic for next week. But I was thinking about this, and one thing, I think maybe the best way to sort of appreciate this is read a good biography of Benjamin Franklin. Like read Walter Isaacson's biography of Benjamin Franklin, because Benjamin Franklin, when you read that, and when you're reading about Franklin and his life, this is a life that could not have been lived anywhere but America. And so Franklin becomes maybe the first like quintessential American in a way. So I would recommend if you want to get a sort of a sense of this, anything, and if you're into like documentaries, PBS had a documentary years ago about Benjamin Franklin that was excellent. I think you can find it on Amazon. I would really recommend that. It's just, and he's just really fun. So if you're interested in that. So anyway, I think I will conclude things here. Thank you everybody for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and we will see you next week. And again, thank you to Scott for facilitating this, and thank you to Grove City. Next week, we're going to be talking more about the radicalism of, or not the radicalism, but the political background of why America. And we're going to be looking at the evolution of the idea of individual liberty being a uniquely British thing. So I look forward to that, and I will see you guys next week. Thank you so much.